The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling Industries Tower like bullets against glass. 34 floors above New York's bustling streets, Vincent Sterling stood motionless in his corner office, watching the city blur into watercolor streaks of light and shadow. The irony wasn't lost on him that on the night he was considering ending everything, the sky itself seemed to be weeping. Vincent had built Sterling Industries from nothing. 22, fresh out. A mite with a computer science degree and fire in his belly, he'd started coding in his father's garage. James Sterling, a retired machinist with calloused hands and unwavering faith in his son, had mortgaged the family home to give Vincent his first $50,000. That investment had grown into a $15 billion technology empire, employing over 40,000 people worldwide. But tonight, none of that mattered. The hostile takeover bid from Blackwood Capital had been brutal and surgical. Thomas Blackwood, a corporate raider known for dismantling companies and selling them for parts, had somehow acquired 37% of Sterling Industries stock. The board meeting earlier that day had been a massacre. Half the directors, people Vincent had trusted for years, had sided with Blackwood's offer. The vote was scheduled for next week, and the writing was already on the wall. Vincent loosened his tie, a gesture that would have shocked anyone who knew him. In 15 years of running Sterling Industries, no one had ever seen him anything less than perfectly composed. His reputation was built on an image of unshakable control. He was the CEO who never raised his voice, never showed emotion, never let anyone see him sweat. But inside his chest, something had been breaking for months. The pressure of fighting, Blackwood, the sleepless nights, and the constant legal battles had all taken their toll. More than that, though, was the loneliness. Vincent realized he had become a stranger to himself, a man defined entirely by his company, his success, his image. On his mahogany desk lay a letter he'd written, but couldn't bring himself to send. Not his resignation to the board, but to life itself. The thought had crept in slowly over the past weeks, like poison seeping through his veins. What was the point of fighting anymore? His father was gone, taken by cancer 3 years earlier. Mother had died when he was 12. His sister Diana lived in California, hadn't spoken to him in 2 years after a fight about their father's funeral arrangements. Vincent had poured everything into Sterling Industries because it was all he had left of his father's faith in him. But now even that was slipping away. Blackwood would tear the company apart, fire half the workforce, and sell the technology to the highest bidder. Everything James Sterling had believed in would be reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Frowned. The cleaning crew never disturbed him, and security would have called first. The knock came again, gentle but persistent. "Come in," he called, not bothering to straighten his tie or fix his posture. The door opened, and Grace Mitchell stepped inside. Vincent's executive assistant was 29 years old. Dark brown hair usually pulled back in a professional bun, and intelligent green eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a simple black dress and carried a manila folder. But something about her presence seemed different tonight, less formal, more human. "Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Sterling," she said quietly. "I saw your light was still on." In the 3 years Grace had worked for him, she'd been the perfect assistant, efficient, discreet, almost invisible. She anticipated his needs, managed his schedule flawlessly, and never asked personal questions. He realized he knew almost nothing about her life outside these walls. "It's late, Grace. You should be home." She stepped closer to his desk, and he noticed she looked tired, not just end-of-day tired, but bone-deep, exhausted, the kind that came from carrying too much for too long. "I could say the same to you," she replied, and there was something in her voice that made him look up sharply. She'd never spoken to him like that before, with familiarity instead of deference. Grace set the folder on his desk and glanced at the resignation letter. Her eyes lingered on it for a moment before meeting his gaze. "Is that what I think it is?" she asked softly. Vincent felt the heat rise in his cheeks. He should have put the letter away, maintained his image of control. Instead, he found himself nodding. The board will side with Blackwood next week, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. 15 years of work, and they're going to hand it over to someone who sees it as nothing more than assets to liquidate. Grace didn't respond immediately. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited. Another breach of their usual professional dynamic. "I've been working late too," she said, "going through some old files for the legal team. I found something I think you should see." She opened the manila folder and pulled out a yellowed envelope. Vincent's breath caught when he saw the handwriting on the front, his name written in his father's careful script. "Where did you find this?" he whispered. "In your father's old office files, the ones we moved to storage after he passed." It was tucked inside his copy of the original incorporation papers. Vincent's hands trembled slightly as he took the envelope. He'd thought he'd found all of his father's personal effects years ago. It felt like receiving a message from beyond. The grave-with careful fingers, Vincent opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. His father's handwriting was shakier than usual, suggesting it had been written during his final illness. "My dear son," the letter began. Vincent's vision blurred as he continued reading silently, but Grace's voice interrupted him. "Would you like me to leave you alone to read it?" she asked gently. He looked up at her, this woman who had been a constant presence in his life for 3 years, but whom he'd never really seen. Something in her expression, a combination of understanding and quiet strength, made him shake his head. "Oh," he said, and began to read his father's words aloud, filling the empty office with their warmth. "If you're reading this, then something has gone wrong and you're facing a darkness I hoped you'd never have to endure alone. I know you think success means never showing weakness, never asking for help. I taught you that, and I was wrong. The strongest thing a man can do is let someone see him when he's broken and ask them to help him stand back up. Don't carry this burden alone, Vincent. Find someone who sees past the money and the power to the man your mother and I raised. Let them in. Let them stay." Vincent finished reading and set the letter down with shaking hands. For the first time in years, tears threatened to spill from his eyes. He felt more exposed than he ever had in his life, sitting there with his carefully constructed walls crumbling around him. Grace leaned forward in her chair, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Those 7 words hit Vincent like a physical blow. He looked at Grace, really looked at her, and for the first time saw not just his efficient assistant, but a woman who had been watching him slowly destroy himself and had chosen to stay. Who had found his father's letter and brought it to him, not because it was her job, but because she cared. "I don't know how to not carry it alone," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I've been doing it for so long." Grace stood up and walked around his desk, something she'd never done before. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and Vincent felt something inside his chest that had been frozen for years begin to thaw. "Then let me help you learn," she said simply. In that moment, as rain continued to streak down the windows and the city hummed below them, Vincent Sterling began to understand that sometimes salvation comes not in grand gestures or miraculous interventions, but in the quiet courage of one person who refuses to let you face the darkness alone. The resignation letter remained on his desk, but suddenly it felt less like an inevitability and more like just another piece of paper. Because for the first time in 3 years, Vincent wasn't facing his demons by himself. The next morning arrived. Gray and cold, but Vincent Sterling felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. He'd barely slept, replaying Grace's words and his father's letter over and over in his mind. For the first time since the hostile takeover began, he wasn't thinking about defeat. He was thinking about fighting back, but differently this time. Grace arrived at the office earlier than usual, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the small cafe downstairs. Instead of using the expensive machine in the executive break room, when she knocked on his door, Vincent noticed she looked different. Her hair was down, flowing in soft waves past her shoulders, and she wore a navy blue dress that made her green eyes more vibrant. "I thought you might need real coffee today," she said, offering him one of the cups. "It's the kind that doesn't come from a machine that costs more than most people's cars." Vincent accepted the coffee gratefully, surprised by how much better it tasted than his usual brew. "Grace," he began, then stopped. He realized he was about to thank her for something that went far beyond her job description. seeing him as a person when he'd forgotten how to see himself that way. She seemed to understand. "We have a board meeting in 3 days," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. What if instead of giving up, we gave them something they weren't expecting? For the next hour, they talked. Not about schedules or meetings or corporate protocols, but about the company Vincent's father had believed in, the employees who depended on their jobs, and the legacy worth fighting for. Grace had insights Vincent had never considered. Perspectives from someone who moved through every level of the company and saw things he'd missed from his corner office. By the time the sun broke through the gray clouds, they had the outline of a plan, not just a business strategy, but a reminder of what Sterling Industries really meant. 3 days later, Vincent Sterling walked into the boardroom, not as a defeated CEO, but as a man who had remembered what he was fighting for.
Chris.
Sat beside him, no longer just his assistant, but his partner in this battle for the company's soul. The presentation Vincent gave that day wasn't about stock prices or profit margins. It was about the janitor who had put 3 kids through college, working for Sterling Industries. About the software engineer who had developed a revolutionary accessibility program on company time because Vincent had given her the freedom to pursue her passion. About the 40,000 families whose lives would be shattered if Blackwood Capital got its way. He spoke about his father's vision, about building something that mattered beyond quarterly reports. And for the first time in years, Vincent Sterling spoke from his heart instead of from a prepared script. The vote was closer than anyone had expected. In the end, it came down to Margaret Chen, the longest-serving board member, who had known Vincent since he was a young man desperate to prove himself. "I've watched you build this company, Vincent," she said, "but I've also watched you lose yourself in the process. Today I saw the man your father believed in, the man we all believed in. Blackwood Capital's takeover bid failed by a single vote. 6 months later, Sterling Industries was stronger than ever. Vincent had restructured the company to be more resilient against future attacks. But more importantly, he had restructured his life. Still worked hard, but he also went home at reasonable hours. He knew his employees' names and their stories. He remembered what it felt like to be human. And every morning, Grace Mitchell brought him real coffee from the cafe downstairs. She was no longer just his assistant. She had become the company's chief operating officer, bringing her insights and compassion to every decision they made. One evening, as they worked late on a project to expand their educational technology division, Grace looked up from her laptop. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. "The letter, the rain?" Vincent set down his pen and looked at her. This remarkable woman who had saved his life simply by refusing to let him face his darkness alone. "Every day," he said, "was the night I learned that the strongest thing you can do isn't carry everything by yourself. It's letting someone help you carry it." Outside, New York City sparkled in the darkness, alive with possibilities. For the first time in years, Vincent Sterling looked forward to tomorrow. The Eon D liked this video if the story touched your heart. Subscribe for more emotional tales, and share with someone who believes in the power of true love. And let us know in the comments. We love connecting with our global community of romance lovers.